Welcome to Whisperwood Stories. Today we read 3 stories. 1 from r/LetsNotMeet, and 2 from r/paranormal. Let's begin. Our first story is from Conscious Glass. Our first house. About 30 years ago, my wife and I saved up enough money to put down the minimum on our first house. It was in an okay but not great neighborhood, and it was built in 1910. Since we didn't have enough money or stuff to warrant a legit moving company, I gathered several friends to help us move. As we were hauling stuff into the house, my next-door neighbor came over and introduced himself to me. His name was Jack. Jack was really friendly and even brought over a plate of cookies to welcome us into the neighborhood. After several minutes of chatting, Jack said something that made me question if I heard him right. Me and the other neighbors were really surprised the house sold, given the incident. I first clarified with him that I had heard him correctly. I did. After an awkward silence, I asked him, "What incident?" He was at first surprised at my lack of knowledge, and then apologetic for bringing it up. "Please," I said again, "what incident?" He went on to tell me that the former owner was an old woman who was bound and gagged, and then her whole house was robbed. Since we bought it from her kids, we had no idea that this had happened. We knew that the neighborhood wasn't wonderful, but that seemed extreme. On our first night there, a strange thing happened. Just after 10 p.m., the phone rang, but when I answered, no one was on the other end. On the second night, at about the same time, it rang again, and again, no one was there. And the third night, and the fourth night. I then called the operator. This is when landlines and operators were a thing, and asked her to see who was calling me just after 10 every night. She said, "No one." The next day, I found my next-door neighbor working in his garden and asked him to explain, in detail, the break-in. When he got to the part about it happening while the neighbor was watching the evening news just after 10 p.m., I couldn't help but shudder. I told my wife, and being the more level-headed one, she thought it was just a weird coincidence. The call came every night that we lived there. It became a bit of a joke for the two of us. "We can't go to sleep yet. The phone's about to ring." And sure enough, it did, like clockwork. 4 years later, our little boy had just turned 3. One day, my wife had asked him to go play in the basement while she cooked dinner. He told her, "That lady doesn't want me down there." He was happy and matter-of-fact when he said it, but my wife and I both looked at each other in horror. He was sometimes hard to understand, so we asked him to repeat what he'd just said, trying our best to not show any emotion. He said exactly the same thing. He never again went down into the basement, and we never again asked him to. Further, we put the house on the market the next month. Our next story is from Cornmeal-jo. Scooby-Doo, where are you? The following event took place around November of 2019, and to this date was by far the strangest thing I've ever encountered. Now, it's worth mentioning that I've always believed in the paranormal, thanks to my mom, who often shared her spooky stories of running into apparitions or hearing disembodied voices on Civil War battlefields when she used to take part in reenactments, back when they allowed us to stay on the original sites. That's pretty rare now. I never really experienced anything myself until my early 20s, and even then, it wasn't anything particularly remarkable. Shadow figures darting from one side of a room to another in the blink of an eye, ghostly footsteps in the guard room of an old fort. Nothing really concrete, and could easily be dismissed as a trick of the light or an overactive imagination. That was until I moved to Williamsburg, Virginia. For those who don't know, Williamsburg was once Virginia's original state capital until it was moved to Richmond sometime in the early 1700s. Not far from here is the site of Jamestown Settlement, which, contrary to popular belief, was actually the first permanent English settlement in North America, beating Plymouth by nearly a decade. It was also home to several native tribes, who undoubtedly hunted or foraged in what are now otherwise built-up, yet largely unassuming locations. Not only is this historically and culturally important, but I believe is directly related to my encounter. At the time, I was renting a small house with my then-girlfriend. The house itself was located across from one of those unassuming locations I mentioned earlier. In this case, a largely empty field that had the overgrown and crumbling remnants of a paved driveway directly across from our front yard that only a few years previously was part of a motel parking lot. Evidently, the motel itself burned down under mysterious circumstances. Rather than rebuild, it was decided to tear everything down and break up the parking lot, save for that one sliver of asphalt. 3 tall pine trees were located in front of this pad, standing in a somewhat staggered line. Now, this field was big, both in length and width. That's what she said. Towards the back was a pretty thick wood line that did have some houses behind it, but you could hardly see them during the day, and only an occasional twinkle of lights during the evening. Towards the end of this field was a steep drop-off that led to an active rail line that was blocked by heavy underbrush and a chain-link fence that would stop anyone from easily accessing the tracks below. This empty field, combined with the dimly lit street, made for a semi-creepy atmosphere. Hardly any cars would pass by at night, adding an unusual sense of stillness to the otherwise busy city. My ex often said she felt the entire thing was off with this plot of land. So every so often, we would go on spontaneous ghost hunts, using what was left of the hotel's driveway as a base of operations. Nothing ever happened, but we kept going back because we were both bored and curious to see if there was any credence to her seemingly unwarranted paranoia. As it turns out, there most certainly was. On this particular night, we were standing in our usual spot, casually talking about random things, when suddenly, I saw what looked to be someone walking with a lit cell phone screen several feet in front of us, the light bobbing up and down like it would normally if being carried by a person. The only issue was neither of us could make out said person. Instead, we saw nothing but blackness. The light slowly made its way across the field before disappearing by the overgrown fence. Weird, sure, but maybe there was some way to access the railway below. Once the light disappeared, all hell broke loose. We began hearing male voices coming from our far left carrying out a loud yet unintelligible conversation. Whatever they were saying certainly wasn't English. At the same time, a thick, low fog began rolling in from the rough location the voices were coming from. It went no further than that spot. At this point, there was no denying that something was definitely off. Yet we kept watching, straining to make out what the voices were saying. Unfortunately, we didn't get to focus on that very long, as bright orbs of light began weaving in and out of the pine tree branches got our attention. They almost appeared to be dancing as well as observing us. However, we remained glued to our spot, determined to see where this was going. Surely we accidentally uncovered some secret drug operation, and they were using Scooby-Doo-esque methods to scare us away. But no, eventually, the orbs faded away behind the bottom of the trees and were replaced by the unmistakably, if not slightly distorted blacker-than-night outlines of human-like beings. Once on the ground, they began peeking around the base of the trees, much like one might do if stalking an animal or enemy by using them as cover and concealment. This went on for several minutes, or seconds. It was hard to tell, because by this point, we were too petrified to move. That's when the being behind the closest tree lunged towards us, his footsteps thudding across the grass. It was around this point that we regained control of our legs and made a mad dash towards the relative safety of our home. Once in, we slammed and bolted the door behind us. Unfortunately, we neglected to close the curtains before we left. Sure enough, this shadow being had followed us home and had itself pressed up against the window, looking into our living room before seemingly fading away. My ex used the opportunity to bravely shut both curtains while I went to close the blinds in our adjacent bedroom. Needless to say, just recounting this story gave me chills. Nothing really odd happened after that night, save for the door to our attic crawlspace seemingly being slightly ajar or fully closed whenever we woke up. Shortly after this, we moved out because our rent was up and didn't have anything blatantly paranormal occur until we moved into an old duplex a year later. Our last story is also from cornmeal-jo, the haunted duplex. I guess since some people have requested it, I'll share the weird occurrences my ex and I had while living in the aforementioned duplex. Personally, I find them to be rather dull, since after a while, whatever was there began to instill aggravation rather than fear or dread, for the most part anyway. The story begins roughly a year and some change after the field incident. We'd chosen this particular duplex because it was cheap, $650 a month, and it had the space we needed. Like a lot of structures of this sort, it could have passed for a normal house, as it had 2 levels that we had full access to. The house itself was built around 1911 and was showing its age in some ways, but otherwise fairly suitable. Minus the roach infestation that we had going on thanks to our neighbors, which, as we would find out after they moved out in the middle of the night, was caused by neglecting the children and a general lack of ever cleaning. The smell coming out of that house was palpable, even from a distance. We were barely into our first night in the new home when it became obvious that something was off. First came the face peeking into one of the upstairs windows as I was unpacking by myself. To this day, I'm genuinely surprised I didn't leave a trail of piss behind me after my brain processed that I was being watched by a man who most certainly shouldn't have been where he was, either alive or dead. I quickly ran and told my ex's father, who had come up from Alabama to help us with the move, and naturally, by the time he got to the room, the face was gone and left me looking stupid. This would go on to become a reoccurring theme during our first few months on the property. At first, he said I must have seen my own reflection, but A, I don't scare easily, and B, I know what my own face looks like, and it certainly wasn't mine. The other theory was that it must have been a teenage boy who lived in the other half, who climbed up onto the roof of the lower add-on, hoping to see some girl-on-girl action. The only issue was that the entire family was black. I'm Mexican, and the face I saw was pale and vaguely see-through. So unless the peeper was also wearing a full face of makeup and hoop earrings... The next few days of settling in were fairly uneventful. It wasn't until a week later when we were watching a show in our upstairs bedroom that we noticed our 2 cats were sitting on the landing, looking down at something intently. Of course, we dismissed it as weird cat behavior, until we heard a very audible, very distinct feminine voice go, meow, 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 from the bottom of the steps. It was almost as though whoever or whatever was trying to get their attention. Of course, we both froze. It was just us at the house at that point. And while it was certainly creepy, we took it as a good sign that the cats weren't hissing or poofing up at this entity, and kind of wrote it off as a weird and possibly a shared overactive imagination. It wasn't until my ex had to use the bathroom, which was unfortunately downstairs, that things sort of escalated into downright scary. Once she came back to bed, she told me that as she was coming back, she saw a male face peering in our middle room window. The only issue was that the window was 8 feet off the ground and had a large AC unit in it that would have prevented anyone from pressing their face against the glass panes. After that night, weird yet random things would happen, such as unexplained thumps and a horrible sense of foreboding in both the kitchen and the back room where I first saw the face. This feeling of dread only really happened at night, with it being the most intense in the kitchen if one went for a late-night snack. I often joke that the spirit was judging us for eating so late, but as I found out later, a previous female tenant had died suddenly in there. Once I knew that, it sort of made sense. Eventually, we contacted 2 separate paranormal investigation groups. The first ones who came through didn't experience anything earth-shattering enough, and despite having the entities directly answer my questions through a spirit box, concluded that it was more than likely our imaginations. The second group wasn't much different, coming to the conclusion that my service-related PTSD was making me paranoid. This was after we all witnessed one of those screw-top flashlights being turned on and off by itself whenever one of the investigators asked it to, along with a few floating entities being caught on a Kinect camera, and being fairly interactive with all of them. It wasn't until our neighbors abandoned their side of the duplex in the middle of the night that it all began to make sense. Once the owners began doing a deep clean and tossing out everything, I noticed a Ouija board sticking out of one of the trash bags they left on the front porch. Unsurprisingly, once the board had been removed from the property, activity slowed down considerably, save for some random pounding on their side of the wall at all hours of the night, and the silhouette of a man staring down at you from their upstairs window. That and cabinet doors in our kitchen randomly flying open, which got really annoying after a while. However, these occurrences were all fairly rare for the next 2 years. That was until we broke up, and I was left all alone without the cats to use as explanation for weird noises. At which point it all became more terrifying than it had ever been. Hoof steps and banging on the roof. A very heavy and sickening presence throughout the entire house was the most disturbing. More thumping on the walls. A friend who stayed over one night reported to see a figure hovering in one of the corners of the living room, his eyes glowing as he looked down at us. After enduring all of this for nearly 2 months, I was incredibly glad to leave when I'd found another place to rent. I feel bad for whoever lives there now. Thank you for listening to Whisperwood Stories. If you enjoyed, don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe down below. Do you have a story that you'd like me to read here? Consider commenting or sending it to whisperwoodsubmissions@gmail.com. The stories in this video were read with the author's permissions. Thank you again for listening, and be sure to check out the original Reddit posts. Want to support me? Check the link below where you can leave a tip if you wish. And remember, don't let the shadows get too close.